Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in. I am Florida State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith. I represent Florida House District 49 in East Orlando, East Orange County. And welcome to our community conversation on the state of gun reform and gun violence prevention in the state of Florida. We know that firearms are the leading cause of death for Americans ages 1 to 17. Here in the United States, there's a gun homicide rate amongst young people that is 49 times higher than that of any other developed nation. And we really need to protect our kids, our youth, and all of our families, really of all ages, from gun violence. We know that Florida has a particular history with gun violence, unfortunately, not only from the shootings that we see happening every day in our communities and in our streets, but also with mass shootings. Our state has a familiarity with mass shootings. In 2016, right here in Central Florida, in our backyard, 49 mostly LGBTQ people of color were murdered by someone with an assault weapon, a Sig Sauer MCX. And just a couple of years after that horrific tragedy that ripped our community apart, another horrific mass shooting in Parkland where 17 people were killed, also by an assault weapon, an AR-15, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. So preventing gun violence is something that's very, very important to Floridians. It's something that is very important to me and something that is very personal to me because I've seen what it has done to our communities firsthand. When I was elected in 2016, the first bill that I introduced as a freshman lawmaker actually was a bill to restrict military-style assault weapons and large capacity magazines. I have introduced that bill every year for 6 years in the Florida legislature because I made a promise to honor those taken by gun violence at Pulse and at Parkland with action. But restrictions on assault weapons are not the end-all solution to gun violence prevention. They're just one part of the puzzle. There's so many things that we can do to protect our communities from gun violence that require us coming together in a bipartisan way to pass laws that make sense, that are common sense, as we always know and we always talk about. And we're going to discuss that today with a lot of folks who are experts. So I'd like to welcome two really awesome guests that are going to be joining us today from the Giffords National Law Center. We're going to be joined by two amazing folks that are part of their team. And first, we have Samantha Barrios. Samantha Barrios is the Giffords Florida director, and I'm really excited to welcome her on. Just to give you some background on the Giffords National Law Center, they've been fighting for over 25 years to prevent gun violence by researching, drafting, and defending the laws and policies that we know have been proven to save lives from gun violence. Hello, Samantha. I see that you turned your camera on. It's good to see you. I think you're joining us from Miami, right?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm in Miami.
Great, great. Well, as you all know, I'm in Orlando, but just to kind of give you some background on Samantha. So she is the Florida State Director for Giffords in Florida. And before she joined Giffords, Samantha served as the local lead for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in her community in Miami. She's got more than 15 years of experience with activism and involvement in different local, international, and nonprofit organizations, such as the Organization of American States and the United Nations. Samantha has garnered a lot of experience working with political campaigns and in building coalitions, particularly with within gun violence prevention and our movement to prevent gun violence in Hispanic and Latino communities. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your service. And thank you for joining us for this important conversation today, Samantha. We've also got Nico. We've got Nico Bakur, who is the Government Affairs director for the Giffords group. She's actually joining us from Washington, D.C., I believe. And she oversees Giffords, the organization's federal, state, and local legislative strategy. And she serves as their principal liaison to elected officials really at all levels of government, including myself, a state representative. Nico has worked in state capitals around the country, bringing together lawmakers, experts, and stakeholders to advance Giffords' legislative priorities. And prior to joining Giffords, she worked in Trenton, New Jersey, spearheading efforts to pass legislation to prevent gun violence in the Garden State. So, Nico, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us for this conversation and all the work you do.
Oh, thank you so much, Representative. We're so excited to be here with you.
Of course. And to talk about this really, really important topic, the state of gun violence prevention and gun reform in Florida. You know, a lot of folks know that recently President Biden and Democrats in the majority in Congress passed the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And this was a pretty monumental step because if Congress is famous for anything, they are famous for not getting a lot done and certainly not doing a lot to prevent gun violence. And this finally kind of broke through. It was a breakthrough moment after Buffalo and Uvalde and so many other recent and horrific mass shootings that President Biden and advocates were able to achieve this bill. But one thing I always get asked is, what does the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act do? Like what? So we know that this is just a step and it's not all the gun violence prevention reform that we need, but what's in this bill and how is it going to impact us here, especially in Florida?
That's a great question, Representative. So it is a package of policies, and it really does represent the first significant gun safety legislation that we've seen become law at the federal level in nearly 30 years. So that is incredibly exciting. And as you mentioned, it doesn't do everything we want, but it does some significant things. So one of those is that it authorizes federal funding made available for the implementation and establishment of extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws in states, which is really critically important because law enforcement needs to have the resources and the tools to be able to actively implement extreme risk or red flag laws. And this is going to incentivize states that don't have them to do it because they'll know they'll have resources available to them, as well as support those states that have already done the right thing and passed laws like this. It also addresses the dating and or intimate partner loophole, as it's sometimes called. It does help to lessen a key gap in federal law that leaves victims of abuse vulnerable by domestic abusers if they aren't otherwise married to or have lived with or shared a child with a victim. We know that domestic abuse can exist even outside of those specific parameters, and it's really important that we continue to do more to address that, and this was a step in that direction. It also very importantly funds community violence intervention programs. This is a historic $250 million that's going to these types of life-saving programs, which is the largest single investment in US history. And these are programs that in particular are really effective at reducing homicide rates and gun violence in places where there are everyday shootings. That often those types of shootings are really being committed and perpetrated by a very small number of people, but can certainly have a huge impact, a devastating impact to families and communities across states like Florida. These programs have been proven to be effective where they have been funded appropriately and in a sustained way. And we know that we have to do more than just look at mass shootings. We have to address gun violence as it's occurring every single day. So these are incredibly important, and that's a huge step forward. And it also did a few other things that are very specific to gun laws that are slightly less familiar to some. So for example, it requires enhanced background checks for people who are under the age of 21 to purchase different types of long guns. And of course, semi-automatic assault rifles fall into that. It addresses gun trafficking. Believe it or not, there actually has never been a federal statute that clearly defined and penalized firearms trafficking and straw purchasing as such. And this actually now does that. And it updated the language around what it means to be a licensed gun seller, which is a step forward to enhancing, again, background checks and making sure individuals who really are behaving like gun dealers are conducting the federally required background checks as they should be. So those are just a few of the things that this omnibus piece of legislation had taken on. And next, what we need is and Giffords is working to work with the federal government to make sure that this important policy is being implemented at the federal level and therefore also being made accessible to those in states like Florida. And of course, we'll look forward to working with you and others in Florida to make sure you guys have access to all of these resources that become available and anything else we can do to be helpful to you all to make sure the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act has the impact that has been intended and is possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that comprehensive update, Nico. And also congratulations on getting this passed. I mean, 30 years since Congress has taken meaningful action on gun violence prevention in this way. I mean, it's just absolutely historic legislation. And there is so much in this bill. There's still a lot that we need to do, but what an incredible step, especially as it relates to directing funding to states. States like Florida that certainly have still a long ways to go on gun violence prevention and gun reforms. But I also am really, really optimistic about the community violence intervention programs, because some of these local programs that I know are run by oftentimes cities and counties and other partners that come in, like local law enforcement and social workers and other groups play a direct hand in trying to break the cycle of violence in our communities and in our streets. And having the funding to do that, I think, is going to be just absolutely monumental and groundbreaking. So thank you for that. And I have so many questions, but we have so many topics that we want to talk about, because while this federal step was really important, it's also really, really important that state legislatures continue to take action and continue to do the necessary work at the state level to protect our communities from gun violence. Florida, very famously, in 2018, the Florida legislature passed legislation known as the Marjory Stoneman Douglas School Safety Act. Now, similarly, this bill had a lot in it. There was a lot of stuff in there related to funding for school safety and for mental health programs in our schools. On gun safety reforms, it raised the age from 18 to 21. It banned things like bump stocks, which make assault weapons even more dangerous than they already are. And it created basically a extreme risk protection order program, or red flag law, in the state of Florida. Now, whenever I talk about the Marjory Stoneman Douglas School Safety Act, I often mention that, listen, the most important part of this bill, or at least the most important part that has prevented additional incidents of gun violence, has been this extreme risk protection order portion, the red flag portion. Sammy, I know that you know a lot about our red flag laws. I know you both do, actually. Can you explain what the extreme risk protection order concept is, and what these red flag laws mean, and also how it's prevented gun violence in Florida specifically?
Sure. Nico, do you want to take this one?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to. I can share some anecdotes. I was actually working in Florida and a few other places for a short time at the time of the shooting, of course, and had a lot of conversations with many people in Florida about what the right policy would be for them. And this, of course, policy came up time and time again. But we heard a lot of opposition at the time that was very fear-based. And so people were claiming that this is the type of policy that, you know, you don't like your neighbor, you can take away their guns type policy. And that's not what this is. So what is it? It's actually modeled off domestic violence protection orders. And a lot of people don't realize that, but this is rooted in something that we're all very familiar with, that the courts are very familiar with, that is already a part of our processes in states across the country. And what it basically does is it allows law enforcement, in this case, to petition a court for the temporary removal of firearms. And so a judge has to find that evidence has been given that shows a significant level of dangerousness. This is not something that someone can simply obtain by saying they don't like someone or they got a funny feeling about someone. They actually have to give a judge real evidence, and it has to be significant. So I just want to give a couple examples, if that's okay.
Sure.
We actually looked at the first year of implementation of the red flag laws in Broward County after this was passed in Florida, because Florida passed it with bipartisan support. And we wanted to be able to show people, like, here's some of the examples of times when guns were removed from really dangerous situations. Those situations, even from that first year and just in Broward County, involved things like threats of homicide, suicide, family violence, and mass violence. One example is that there was a young man who had been attending a church, newly attending a church in Broward County. He started showing up with a metal plate and several firearms. Church members and the security that the church had hired had urged him to leave his firearms securely safe in his vehicle, and he ignored those requests. He was easily agitated, made threats on site, and bragged about animal abuse. There was social media postings and other real clear, hard evidence that this individual was posing a danger. They presented all of the evidence and this pattern of behavior, because they found out this had happened elsewhere as well, and evidence of a danger. And the judge was able to present a 1-year protective order in that case. And they ended up removing multiple firearms from this individual, as well as several rounds of ammunition. And in another case, there had been an individual who had been threatening a school shooting. And again, law enforcement was able to intervene and actually get one of these orders that will now prohibit that individual from being able to legally go and buy a gun easily for the next year. So again, these help de-escalate situations as well as protect people. And a lot of the times we don't get to hear of examples of where these types of laws have been effective, because they're doing their job. They're preventing tragedies.
Yeah, they're preventing. And you've described scenarios, back to the reason why they're called extreme risk protection orders. A judge is only going to step in and intervene when someone has demonstrated that they are an extreme risk to themselves or others by having access to a firearm. And that seems to be, it seems to be a tall order to convince a judge of that. You've got to have evidence, you've got to have receipts. This is not based on something silly like an argument with a colleague at a workplace or something like that, unless it escalates to that threatening type of level. I understand that this has still been used many, many times in Florida to prevent incidences of gun violence. I've heard as many as 8,000 or 9,000 times it's been used.
Yeah, in fact, there were 255 cases in that first year in Broward County that we looked at. So I believe between March of 2018 and March of 2019, 255 instances, the vast majority of which a judge did find that there was very credible evidence that firearms should be restricted for that period of time, for a year. And of course, 255 is a significant number. It also demonstrates that there have been a few instances where a judge did determine there wasn't enough evidence and, probably appropriately did not issue the temporary restraining order. That's due process doing its job. But we have these examples now, thanks to the ability to look at petitions that were actually filed, where you really see that these aren't situations of people just pointing fingers at people. These are really dangerous, alarming situations where people need to be able to find some sort of support and help. And this helps them do that when a dangerous situation comes up.
And of course, this is what we already have in Florida law, which is great. But we also know that the way that the law is currently written, the extreme risk protection order law or the red flag law isn't perfect, and that there's ways to improve. We hear people talking, myself included, about, hey, listen, we need to improve and make the red flag law more effective. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a number of different ways that can be done that Giffords supports. And so in some instances, it can be looking at whether or not you are accurately describing what type of evidence should or could be considered by a judge, and what the threshold is that they need to be able to use. But another key one is who's able to seek one of these. And of course, it does have to be somebody who actually knows the individual. It can't be, you can't pass a stranger on the street, get a bad feeling, and go get a red flag petition taken out against them. But one thing that is very commonplace is to allow for at least family members, for example, to be petitioners. And one of the reasons that's really critical is because in addition to law enforcement who have certain tools and of course are charged with our public safety, family members are actually often the ones who see a lot of these signs first and are reporting a lot of these signs and instances to law enforcement seeking their support. But there are, unfortunately, instances where that may not be the safest or most appropriate course of action for an individual if there's not a lot of community trust between individuals and law enforcement, or in the very rare instances where there's some sort of relation to somebody in law enforcement. There are times when people would like to be able to have that conversation and petition the judge separately on their own.
Yeah, and sometimes by the time law enforcement gets involved in a situation where someone has demonstrated that they're a threat to themselves or others, it could be too late. Which is why it's important to allow this additional method for someone to petition the court and still let a judge decide whether someone has gotten to that level where an extreme risk protection order is necessary to protect themselves and others from gun violence. So thank you for that. Expanding red flag laws and making them more effective and improving them is certainly a top priority of mine and many other folks who are interested in preventing gun violence. But it's not the only thing on the list. We also talk a lot about universal criminal background checks. Sammy, I know that you talk about this a lot in your work as the Florida director for Giffords and in Hispanic and Latino communities that you're really a part of and you're doing this work with. Talk to us about what this would mean in Florida particularly.
Sure. Well, as we all know, Florida has no law generally requiring a background check on the purchase of a firearm when the seller is not a licensed dealer. Like federal law, Florida law generally requires gun dealers to conduct background checks on buyers prior to the sale or transfer of the firearm on the dealer's premises. But this does not apply to gun shows or private sellers, which leaves a huge gap in our laws. And it creates some environment where it's incredibly easy for anyone to go and purchase a firearm without having this background check. So therefore, we need to make sure that background checks are implemented on a state level so we can prevent, dangerous people from accessing guns.
Right. And when we talk about how, well, you always are required to get a background check when you buy a gun through a federally licensed dealer, a lot of people don't realize how many folks are selling guns that are not federally licensed. It happens at gun shows, and luckily, due to the bipartisan legislation that came from Congress, the Safer Communities Act, we've raised the bar on what defines and what constitutes a federally licensed dealer at a gun show, but people are still selling guns online. They're selling them person to person or on Craigslist. They're being handed off sometimes between two individuals with no payment whatsoever, which is a big loophole that can mean that guns are getting into the hands of someone who should not have them, someone with a criminal background. Our criminals know these loopholes and they exploit them, which is why it's important to close those loopholes. And this is not just for firearms. I know that there's also movements, particularly around something known as Jamie's Law in Florida. Jamie's Law would require universal criminal background checks, not just for firearms, but also for ammunition, because that's a big loophole in Florida law. You know, it's great that the age to purchase a firearm was raised from 18 to 21, and that a background check is required, but a young person can always steal a firearm from their parent or their guardian and then just go buy bullets at the store with no background check. And so closing these loopholes, and of course, Jamie's Law is named after Jamie Gutenberg, who is one of the students who was murdered in Parkland. And that's a really important step as well. I know that safe storage laws also, Sammy, are a really, really important part of the necessary reform in Florida, especially for kids that often find firearms at home. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how we can enhance safe gun storage laws in Florida?
Yeah, sure. Well, Florida has what we often refer to as a child access prevention law. Under Florida law, any person who stores or leaves a loaded firearm on premises under his or her control, and who knows or reasonably should know that a person under 16 years old is likely to gain access to the firearm without the lawful permission of the minor's parents or person having charge of the minor, or without the supervision required by law, must do the following things. The first thing they have to do is to keep the arm in a securely locked box or container. They have to keep the firearm in a location which is reasonably, and a person would think that it's a safe space for the firearm to be, and to secure the firearm with a trigger lock, what we commonly know as gun locks. So this requirement does not apply when an adult is carrying the firearm or his or her body, but it's within close proximity to any other person, and that she can retrieve and use the firearm from easily or quickly. And however, in Florida, law only makes the person who fails to store the firearm in this matter criminally liable if a minor gains access to the firearm without the lawful permission of his or her parent or legal guardian and possess or exhibits either in a public place or in a rude or careless or angry, threatening manner, as we usually see. While the state should pass broader safe storage law, another important way to make sure people are in fact securing their firearms is by analyzing the responsible storage practices. That means asking parents when you're sending your child to a play date if the gun that they have at home is properly stored, to educate people about the realities of guns in your home, and making things like gun locks accessible to gun owners.
That's really important. I'm glad that you shared so much about that, Sammy, because this is another critical component of gun violence prevention. And of course, we've really covered three main proactive topics, some of the three most important that we can update Florida law in this way in Florida: the safe gun storage laws that you mentioned, strengthening those laws, universal criminal background checks, and also improving our red flag laws. But there's even so much more beyond that. That's before we've even discussed restrictions on large capacity magazines and assault weapons, or strengthening our concealed carry law in the state of Florida, which has opportunity for improvement, maybe even incentivizing our own cities and counties to enact community violence prevention programs to go hand in hand with the federal legislation that has just been passed. I mean, the list of things that we can do goes on, but we also know in Tallahassee, we're often on defense. We're on defense on gun violence prevention, sometimes because Republican lawmakers introduce proposals to loosen our gun laws and to make us less safe. Very famously, recently, Governor Ron DeSantis essentially made a promise that he would sign something known as permitless carry or untrained carry into law before he left office. Now, this is something that is different from open carry, which is something else entirely, but I'm hoping that you can kind of clarify, what does permitless untrained carry mean, and why is it a threat to our state?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So permitless carry is basically the opposite of needing a permit to carry a firearm in public, in a concealed manner, typically. So right now, Florida does actually require that an individual who wants to take their firearm, hide it concealed on their body somewhere, and go to a public place has to have a permit to do that. It's a pretty standard but good permitting process. They require that you show a little bit more than you would just to purchase a firearm. Again, you're bringing this out concealed in public, as well as require some base level of training. Really what the Florida law is looking for is making sure you actually know how to handle that firearm. So the training requirements aren't even that extensive. It's pretty basic 101. Do you know how to operate the firearm that you want to carry around in public?
Take a
so
test, you do things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we've seen is an extreme push by the gun lobby to just try to eliminate any requirements that anybody have a permit even in order to carry their firearm in public. They want anyone to be able to carry a gun anywhere. And as you've seen, that aligns with what their so-called position is on anything related to guns or public safety, which is the more guns, the better, despite all the evidence that shows us otherwise. So it is a pretty extreme move to completely eliminate the permit requirement. And so some states have done that. And what we understand the governor is promising to do in Florida is get rid of not only the requirement for the permit, but therefore any of those additional requirements. Basically, if you can walk into a gun store and buy a gun, you can carry it anywhere you want concealed in Florida, is essentially what he's doing. Well, what does that mean? That means here's like a few of the categories of people who could suddenly be able to walk out of a gun store and carry their firearm concealed without going through the permitting process. Somebody who, for example, has been convicted of a violent misdemeanor crime in the last 3 years. Somebody who has multiple convictions for things like DUI. Someone who is subject to an emergency or ex parte domestic violence restraining order if there hasn't yet been a final court hearing, even if there's been a restraining order to issue in between, and people subject to other restraining orders against violence. These are pretty serious demonstrations of disregard for other people's safety, well-being, and impulsivity, and dangerousness and violence. And again, to say we are not even going to put into place a process that says these people have even ever safely operated or know how to use a firearm in public, but then to allow individuals who have a demonstrated history of either violence or not caring for the general well-being and public safety, to carry a firearm in all of our public spaces. That's pretty wild. And you think about a lot of these places, and many places are really sensitive. You think about all the times you open an article and read about a big fight at a sporting event, sometimes a high school sporting event, or you read about, again, the instance of the individual who kept showing up at church. And we know that there have been so many hate motivated crimes across this country. And the idea of saying we want to make it so that we're not even checking that these individuals aren't, dangerous, and or know how to even operate a firearm, that's pretty alarming, I think. And there are
Or go through the
other
additional
restrictions.
background checks required to get that concealed carry permit, which would
Exactly.
essentially be obsolete in the case of permitless carry.
Absolutely. And it is, there is a growing threat. And as you mentioned, right now, the governor has promised to pass permitless carry. We know Florida's even seen legislation introduced that could eliminate the restrictions on open carry that you guys have right now. Like concealed carry, both of these are things that are very dangerous that we need to keep an eye out for. That would threaten public safety in Florida.
And just to be clear, supporters of this measure, in particular, permitless carry, often refer to it as this so-called constitutional carry.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a thing. Constitutional carry is a made-up term, and there is no constitutional right to publicly carry a firearm without a permit or training. That does not exist, right?
That's correct. That does not exist. That is a made-up term by the gun lobby to try to put weight behind what is plainly a dangerous policy that the majority of Americans and residents in this country oppose.
Dangerous because, just to be clear, Nico, we have seen states that have enacted permitless carry and have also subsequently, as a result, seen increases in incidents of gun violence. Is that right?
That's right. We've seen increases of incidents and also chaos and confusion, both for every family and community across the state, as well as like law enforcement, for example. So, we've seen a lot of the use of firearms to be used in forms that are threatening. Some of those instances, many I actually would guess, are not reported as such. So if you could imagine the uptick in dangerousness that we know exists when you repeal any requirements that somebody pass a background check or be trained in their firearms, imagine the things you're not hearing about regularly. All the times individuals then wave their firearm in an active road rage. Maybe they don't fire it. Maybe there actually is never a police report, or maybe the police report doesn't get sort of classified or reported on as a gun incident. Again, we talk a lot about the horrific statistics of people injured and killed by gun violence. And it's astonishing to realize that not only are those horrific numbers the reality of the gun lobby's propaganda and efforts, it's also just a fraction of the ways in which guns are used to threaten, harass, and intimidate people. And that's even more so, in states that have no requirements for who can brandish them and carry them around in public.
So true. So true. Thank you for all of this information. We're getting to the end of our discussion, but I do want to put the last question actually in front of Sammy, which is how can people get involved? How can they push for change and push for gun reform in the state of Florida if this is something that they really want to get involved with, as I have?
Sure. So the first thing that we're asking Floridians, listeners and residents, is to reach out to us. I mean, we have already spoken about the dangers of Governor DeSantis saying that he wants to pass permitless carry. So we think it's very important that we come together and we oppose that. We know that there's no interest whatsoever in any Floridians to support something like this. So the first thing that we're going to ask you is to join our rapid response Twitter and WhatsApp group. You will be helping to amplify our message, to write letters to the editor, and Giffords can help do that. So you just need to reach out to us. We're hosting house parties in which we come to your house. We have a casual conversation with your friends, community members, to tell you what Giffords is about and what's at stake. And also, and for that, I'm going to be sharing my email address, which is S as in Sam, Barrios, which is BARRIOS @giffords.org. Send me an email. I'm in Miami. We'll love to go up to Orlando and have that conversation with you and your family. And last but not least, visit our website, which is www.giffords.org. We have amazing reports on gun safety and gun violence prevention. We have data there. And one exciting thing is that we have a Spanish language hub too there. So if you feel like you want to share with friends and family who are not used to having this conversation in Spanish, that's a great resource. And that's it. We really hope that you join us because we have to do this together.
Thank you, Sammy. Thank you so much. Thanks to you and Nico for all the work you do. And also thanks just to the Giffords National Law Center overall. I know that this very, very important work is very personal to both of you. It's personal to Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who I had the pleasure of welcoming to Orlando just a few short weeks ago, where she paid her respects to the 49 who were taken at Pulse nightclub. I was there to give her a tour and talk about the impact of that shooting on the Orlando community, on the LGBTQ and Hispanic and Latino community as well. And I was just so moved to be a part of that experience with someone like Gabby, who is so inspirational in how she's been able to survive gun violence and turn her life into a call for advocacy to prevent gun violence. It's very, very inspiring. And just to recap what we've talked about today, the state of gun reform in Florida. It's so great that we were able to pass this legislation at the federal level, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act signed by President Joe Biden. First time in 30 years that we've seen this type of gun violence prevention legislation pass in Congress, but that's just the beginning. There's so much more work to do, especially in Florida, where we've got to expand and improve our red flag laws, enact universal criminal background checks, make sure that we enhance our safe gun storage laws, and beat back against this permitless carry nonsense that will only put our communities at further risk. So thank you for joining us for this conversation. Thanks to everyone who tuned in for this conversation as well on Facebook. You can always reach out to our office, carlos.smith@myfloridahouse.gov. But this has been a great conversation and really appreciate you both, Sammy and Nico, for joining it. Thanks to the Giffords Law Center.
Thank you, Representative, and thank you for everything you're doing on the issue of gun safety. We're hoping that there are more who think like you in Tallahassee to help you win this fight.
I absolutely second Nico. Thank you so much, Representative Smith, for giving us the space.
Thank you all for joining the space. And that's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much. Have a good day.